Okay, hi everyone. We are live. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Isabelle Tavares, community reporter for Planet Detroit, covering environmental and public health impacts in Southwest Detroit. Today's webinar is part of our series on a century of pollution from Michigan's Zug Island. This reporting and conversation are made possible with support from the Earth Journalism Network and Report for America. We're excited to share what we've learned and introduce you to people doing this work in communities and policy spaces. Listeners, please feel free to post questions in the comments on the social platform where you're watching, and we'll be monitoring them and do our best to bring them into the conversation. For more than a century, heavy industry on Zug Island has shaped not just the skyline of Southwest Detroit, but the air people breathe, the health outcomes families experience, and the daily reality of entire communities. For many residents, this isn't abstract. It's asthma inhalers, missed school days, and the question of whether the air outside is safe to breathe. A federal judge recently found DTE Energy liable for Clean Air Act violations at its Zug Island facility, EES Coke battery, ordering it to pay $100 million and fund pollution controls and community air quality projects. And just yesterday, DTE filed their appeal to the Sixth Circuit Court. But today, we're not here to relitigate that case. We're here to ask a different set of questions. What actually changes now? What does accountability look like in practice? And what would it take for communities that have lived with this pollution for generations to finally see meaningful change? This is a solutions-focused conversation about what comes next for industry, for regulators, and most importantly, for the people who live closest to the impacts. I'm joined today by two people who bring critical perspectives to this moment. We have Nick Leonard, the Executive Director of the Great Lakes Environmental Law Center and attorney representing the Sierra Club in the case, and Rhonda Anderson, who grew up in River Rouge and has spent most of her adult life in Detroit. She is a 2-decade member of the Sierra Club and has previously focused her environmental justice organizing efforts on the Henry Ford Hospital incinerator, Canflow Environmental Services, and lead smelting in Detroit. Thank you both for being here. Let's start with the big picture. Nick, I want to begin with you and ground us in what just happened and why it matters. So why should people in and beyond Detroit care about the federal case?
Yeah, the federal case was really one of the most significant Clean Air Act rulings in recent years, particularly Clean Air Act enforcement. Certainly the sort of largest Clean Air Act enforcement case that we've seen in Michigan in the past several decades. Essentially, the dispute in the case was about a change that EES Coke made and DTE made at the coke oven battery on Zug Island. In 2014, they received approval to basically burn unlimited amounts of coke oven gas, which is both the fuel that the coke battery burns, as well as a byproduct of generating coke. Now, the problem arose a few years after, and what essentially happened was the coke oven battery started to emit a lot more pollution than they had estimated in the permitting process, and specifically like hundreds of tons of sulfur dioxide above what the company had estimated in order to get their permit. And that mattered because in general, when companies come to get their permits, they have to estimate the amount of pollution that will increase from their facility. And based on those estimates, their sort of permit is either classified as a minor modification or a major modification. And the differences are really important because a minor modification basically goes through a less stringent permitting review. They have to install, they generally don't have to install really up-to-date pollution controls. They can just kind of continue with business as usual. But if it's a major modification, particularly in this area, which was already struggling to meet air quality standards for sulfur dioxide, they would have had to install really stringent pollution control technology that could lower their sulfur dioxide emissions by like approximately 95, 98%. And so why it was important is it basically DTE and EES Coke avoided installing this really effective pollution control technology at a time when Southwest Detroit, River Rouge, Ecorse were really struggling with high levels of sulfur dioxide pollution. As a result, and that kind of exposure can create all sorts of impacts: asthma hospitalizations, increased asthma cases, cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's. And so it was a really important time for the companies to sort of more stringently regulate their pollution and follow the law, essentially. And they more or less didn't. And so the ultimate result was the federal judge penalized the defendants, being DTE and EAS Coke, $100 million, ordered them to pay $20 million for a community fund, and ordered them to go get the permits they should have gotten back in 2014.
Mm-hmm. And, this is a highly technical case, but with real public health stakes. One of the striking elements was the expert testimony, both on how far the pollution traveled and its health impacts. So what stood out most to you from that evidence?
A couple of things. So there are two pollutants at issue. The one pollutant that was directly emitted by the facility was sulfur dioxide. But then when sulfur dioxide gets into the environment, it contributes to the formation of fine particulate matter, or PM2.5. And so those were kind of the two air pollutants that the case was about. Sulfur dioxide is a pretty localized pollutant. It doesn't travel very far. But what stood out was just how severe the impacts were nearby the facility. And in the communities like Southwest Detroit, River Rouge, and Ecorse. And one of the government's experts basically testified that the excess emissions alone may be enough to essentially trigger to exceed the standard all by itself. And those standards are usually meant to encompass emissions from everybody, from everywhere, like steel plants, coal plants, all of it. But the excess emissions from this facility were so severe that it was almost approaching that standard all by itself. Now, what stood out for fine particulate matter was just how far the impacts were reaching. Because unlike sulfur dioxide, fine particulate matter travels great distances. So what the expert in this case found was essentially DTE and EAS Coke's excess emissions were impacting states on the East Coast, New York, Massachusetts, and even states like as far away as Missouri, places like that. So the impact wasn't just the sulfur dioxide impacts were localized and intense. And then the fine particulate matter impacts were going all over the country and impacting people in places you would never expect.
Mm-hmm. And the case also raised questions about corporate responsibility. So how did the ruling address DTE's role as a parent company?
Yeah, so initially the case was just brought against EES Coke LLC, which is a subsidiary of DTE. And as the case was moving along, it became apparent through sort of documents that were exchanged and evidence that was shared that DTE had a pretty sizable role in operating the facility. And so normally for cases like this, and you see this all the time, large companies will set up subsidiaries to basically try to protect themselves from being liable for anything that goes wrong at that given facility. And that's generally okay, legally speaking, so long as the facility doesn't, the parent company doesn't involve itself in the day-to-day operations of the facility. And here, what the court found once these DTE companies were added as defendants was essentially that Coke Battery could not function without DTE oversight. And it found that based on the fact that EES Coke Battery didn't have a bank account, it had 0 employees, and basically DTE was in charge of everything from financial decisions to environmental compliance to running day-to-day operations. And so based on that evidence, the court basically said, well, not only is EES Coke Battery, the subsidiary, liable, but these 3 DTE entities, all the way up to DTE Energy Company, are liable based on their involvement in sort of running and operating the facility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that gives us a sense of why this case matters on paper. Thank you for that foundation. Let's talk about what it means for people and communities every day. Rhonda, I would love to bring the conversation to you here. For people who haven't lived near Zug Island, it can be hard to fully grasp what the experience is like. You grew up in River Rouge and have lived in Detroit for most of your adult life. How has growing up and living near heavy industry shaped your day-to-day experience?
Well, um, in a number of ways. When you live next to or in proximity to heavy industry, and this area that we're talking about is one of the most industrialized areas in the state of Michigan. And because of that, and the number of polluting facilities like DTE, and what it emits is the SO2. Okay, so there's going to be some direct health impacts on that surrounding community. That surrounding community, a lot of them are Black, African American. The impact is on all of the age groups. Okay, so it's going to be primary with the children, young ones, asthma, older residents of that area. It's going to be cardiovascular disease. It's going to be asthma as well. And it's going to be some other issues like even high blood pressure, okay, which a lot of us have been told is our own personal fault, because, of our lifestyle. When in actuality, a lot of it is because of where we live and the impact from pollution. So EES Coke has been a dirty um, partner, community partner for years and years and years, and thus has had a very negative impact on the health and quality of life of the residents in this area.
Mm-hmm. You've shared powerful stories from what you saw as a child to the health impacts in the community. A child having an asthma attack outside of an elementary school. What do you wish more people understood about living near Zug Island?
Just how dangerous it is. I think people would generally think, life in an area like this was just normal every day. You don't think about it, but it's not normal. Asthma is not normal. Heart attacks, they're not normal. Although they happen so frequently, we may think that they are, but it's not. We shouldn't have to be burdened with these health impacts with a industry like EES Coke that could have put in this equipment to kind of limit the amount of toxic emissions, but they didn't. See,
Mm-hmm.
and who's protecting us? The state? Have you heard from them?
Mm-hmm.
I haven't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, speaking of that, what was it like to hear testimony in federal court from fellow organizers, Dr. Dolores Leonard, Teresa Landrum, Vicki Dobbins, about something that has affected your entire life?
Yeah, I think one of the more important portions of this trial was having them testify, having them um, to tell how their daily lives are impacted. I think Teresa talked about how she can't ride her bike. How a lot of the residents don't open their windows. This is, to me, this is extreme. How many people in some of the suburbs have to deal with this? I don't think so. But this area has a very long history of pollution. And another concern is the cumulative impact, because it's not just EES Coke.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Thank you for sharing that. It's a powerful reminder of what's at stake here. I want to look ahead a bit. When people hear about a major ruling like this, I think a natural question is what actually changes on the ground. When we talk about compliance going forward, what does that actually mean in practice, and what will be different on the ground?
Yeah, we'll have to wait and see, perhaps, because the defendants, DTE and ESCO, actually just yesterday filed their notice of appeal with the Federal Court of Appeals, as well as what's called a motion to stay, which is essentially asking the court to pause any sort of requirement that they implement the court's judgment while the appeal plays out in the Federal Court of Appeals. Now, the judge may grant that, they may not. We'll have to wait and see. But assuming that the judge's order is implemented, it would mean a few things. Number one is they would have to go and get the permits that they were required to get in 2014 and basically install more effective pollution control for sulfur dioxide, pollution control that would control sulfur dioxide emissions by limit them by like 98%. And so they would have to do that pretty quickly, and that would mean significantly less sulfur dioxide pollution than what's currently in the community. They would have to pay a $100 million penalty that would go to the U.S. Treasury. And then they would have to also, and this is something that Sierra Club fought very hard for, convene a community committee that would be in charge of dispersing a $20 million, basically like community health fund. And that would generally go towards projects that can improve environmental quality or public health in the E-Course, 48217 zip code, or River Rouge communities. Now, like I said, all this is contingent on sort of hopefully the judge sort of allowing these things to move forward and any results in the appeal. But those are the things that would sort of change on the ground, is the company would have to sort of pay a penalty, commit $20 million for the community fund, and update their pollution control technology.
Yeah, speaking of pollution control technology, there's been discussion of technology fixes like desulfurization. Are these proven solutions, and how confident should the public be that they'll work?
Yeah, they are pretty proven. Many Coke batteries throughout the country have installed them, and that was the point that we made in the case. That was the point that Department of Justice made in the case, is like, look, we're not asking for like you to sort of go with super unproven technology that nobody has installed. Most Coke oven batteries have installed this technology already. And so we're just kind of asking them to catch up to everybody else and do something like the court noted that was that they were legally required to do back in 2014 and that they didn't essentially do. And so, that's the hope, is that they'll sort of finally come around and do what their peers are doing, do what their other companies that run a similar facility are doing.
Yeah. And, I want to pause on that for a second, because a lot of this can sound technical. And at the end of the day, this is about whether emissions go down and whether people are safer. So the key question is, will this actually work? And that brings us to the question of accountability, not just what's required, but what's enforced. Nick, you already walked us through the appeal process. While that plays out, this is for both of you. What are organizations like yours focused on right now?
Well, Sierra Club and its operation here in Detroit and the state of Michigan, they're continuing to do some of the same things that they've been doing over decades. And that is some of that is to make these industries accountable. Now, the problem here is that industry seems to be more important than residents' lives and their health. And I hope you understand this. and especially when it comes to Black people. See, our value is less than other people's value, and it's definitely less than corporate America. So even when things go to the state, and I think one of the things that is a little peculiar is because we haven't heard from the state of Michigan, from the Eagle, the agency that should be monitoring all of this. We haven't heard a word. You have an environmental justice division in Eagle. Haven't heard a word. They know all of this. So what's going on there? Where is our protection? Where is our voice? And what it looks like is coming from organizations like the Sierra Club, like Earth Justice, like so many others, and that's all right. But we also need support from the state. We pay taxes too.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're going to be focused on is obviously defending this court's decision through the appeal and trying to make sure that the remedies the court ordered get put in place as quickly as possible. We talked a little bit at the outset on sort of like the impacts of this case. And I think it's worth underscoring just like how severe the impacts are from the pollution that this coke battery emitted, because sometimes it can be you don't perceive it, you don't smell it, you don't know it sort of when you're exposed to it. But one of the experts in this case basically said that just from the 2019 emissions alone, the sulfur dioxide caused 26 premature deaths, 4 heart attacks, 8,000 respiratory symptom days, about 5 new Alzheimer cases, and about 5 new asthma cases. And that's just like 1 year of the excess emissions. So not even the facility's total emissions, just the amount that they emitted that they were not allowed to. And so these are really, really significant impacts. And that's why, we think there should be no delay in getting the remedy the court ordered up and running. And we think that this case was pretty simple, that the coke battery emitted more pollution than they were allowed to. It didn't take the necessary steps to protect community members and their neighbors. And so we think it's really, really important that they get to work addressing this issue as quick as possible. And like Rhonda mentioned, hold both the company accountable and kind of the court of public opinion, and hold our state accountable for not being present in this case, not joining in on it, and not protecting its residents.
Mm-hmm. I want to stay with that and look forward. This isn't the first time industry has had to work with the community after a lawsuit. What lessons could be carried from past efforts?
Well, in my opinion, a major lesson would be that the state do what they're supposed to do and protect the health and safety of the residents of this of the state, but in particular to the environmental justice communities. And we know through the study of environmental justice that a part of that is environmental racism. So we need someone that will listen to these communities, to our communities. And this isn't easy because this has been going on for decades and decades, as long as I've been alive, which was before the Clean Air Act. So what do? Like, who's listening to us? And it turns out it's going to be organizations like the Sierra Club, Earth Justice, Nick's law firm, and things like that. And so how can we hold accountable the state of Michigan?
Mm-hmm.
We also need a health study
Mm-hmm.
And part of the frustration, I think, is that DT can get started on addressing these things right now. It's a sort of decision whether to appeal and what to seek a stay on, and throughout this case, they've kind of taken a very aggressive posture, and they've sought to discredit residents' sort of narratives, residents' lived experience at every turn. And so, like, these are sort of really harmful things to the residents that we've worked with. I think it shows the sort of, it kind of peels back the public relations veneer that you commonly get when you're interacting with a large company. And it shows where their sort of values truly lie. And in this case, I think, they want to try to operate this facility for as long as possible for as little money as possible. And that's so far been their sole motivation, which is disappointing to see. You would expect, I think, a company like DTE to want to do a bit better.
Mm-hmm. There's funding tied to this case. What would meaningful investment in community health actually look like to each of you?
Well, there's so many things that can be done. So this, when we get this award, because we're going to get it, right, Nick? All right. So we can put in place weatherization programs where residents in the surrounding area can invest in their own homes. We could offer new roofs, windows. Wouldn't it be nice for them to have the proper windows? And but I think a more important benefit to the community is going to be to be able to walk in this community. See, there ain't a whole lot of moving and walking, because if you do, it's possible that you can come down with what? An asthma attack. With what? Your blood pressure can go up. So the quality of life in this community could improve drastically, especially in cooperation with the other industries.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's I think ultimately that's a question we want to be posed to sort of residents, which is why we advocated for the creation of this community committee to essentially figure out what's the best way to disperse these funds. And that community committee has to be made up of 3 residents from 48217, Ecorse, and River Rouge, 2 representatives from environmental advocacy organizations, 1 academic that focuses their research on environmental and public health, and then 1 representative of DT or the defendants. And so it's a very sort of community-centric committee. I mean, I think ultimately some of the things that may come out of that process are things that will help residents better cope with poor air quality. And so it's things like Rhonda mentioned about like improving their homes so that they can essentially stay inside, turn on their air conditioning. A lot of folks don't have air conditioning. And so it can be like, we've certainly talked with a lot of residents where feel like they have to close their windows, but if it's 95 degrees outside, you can only do that for so long before your home becomes unbearable. Things like purchasing air purifiers and things like improving community spaces. But it's also important, I think, to mention, like, there's a limit, I think, to the sort of things we can do to help residents cope with these harms. And this is a community that's also dealing with a multitude of air pollution problems. Like the level of fine particulate matter is above health-based standards in this community. Level of ozone is above health-based standards in this community. And so that's why this case is so important, is because all of these things mix together to cause respiratory and cardiovascular health impacts. And if we're going to, give these people in these communities a safe place to live, a place where they can essentially be outside and play outside and enjoy their communities, we have to start with this case and hold polluters accountable when they break the law, especially in a significant way. But then, we got to continue the work of essentially addressing the very high levels of pollution that exist already in this community. And that comes from industrial facilities, cars and trucks, a number of different things. And so, that kind of work is just beginning.
Isabelle, can I add that this community, the 3 cities, Ecorse, River Rouge, 48217, they're one of the best organized communities, hardworking, committed communities with residents that understand. It took them a long time, but they understand what's going on. And so they're not novices. They're not ignorant of the impact from this industry, from not only this one, but the other ones. And I think that is example of organizations working with them, in particular the Sierra Club, working with this community over decades now. We need that. And there are communities like this across this nation, this country. And some, believe it or not, are worse. So as we move forward, in having all the things that the people need, we need to address these issues, restrict emissions, and have a better quality of life for a lot more people.
Yeah, thank you. Just 2 more questions, and then we'll close and get to audience questions. What does it actually look like for industry and community to coexist in a way that's fair and sustainable?
Nick, you take that one because I'm not sure.
Well, it starts with sort of being accountable to the laws and regulations, I think, that are in place, and essentially following those laws. And, when you're found to have not followed them, addressing it in a timely fashion, which obviously EES, Coke, and DT have not done here. And, one of the things that we brought up in the case was, a lot of companies have established, they have like community committees to try to repair their relationships with the communities. And sometimes that works really well, sometimes it doesn't. It doesn't always mean the relationship goes a lot better, but at least there's lines of communication. I think an example of this is Marathon Oil Refinery in Southwest Detroit. And not to say it's an end-all be-all, but it's a starting point. And, one of the points we raised in this case was, DT and ES Coke haven't even done that. Like, they haven't even really established sort of a line of communication with local residents. And so, ultimately what it means is going above and beyond sometimes the sort of bare minimum requirements and taking action to sort of proactively to lower your community impact, and then helping neighbors live with the impacts that you do create. Sort of saying like, okay, we know we're going to, regardless of what we do, we're going to cause some level of harm in your community. Like, that's just inherent in what our business. But we'll do something to help you live with it. And so I think, that's ideally the best thing that communities or like that companies can do. And then there's another question of like, well, what should the role of state government and federal government be here as well? Like, should they be sort of looking at things to kind of, move away from just companies taking voluntary action and maybe requiring polluters to take more action to address community needs? Because I think that's necessary too.
I think too that there's a number of impacts from DTE. When they raised the rates of the utility, that is a big impact on residents, with many of them not even being able to afford. I would like to see how many shutoff actually happen. I know as a single mother, I've experienced that, and it's one of the most uncontrollable things that a family can deal with, especially with children.
Mm-hmm.
And so this community is dealing with the pollution, and then turned around and being hit in the gut with a rate increase. So definitely there's some things that they can do to um, to better respect and partner with the community.
Mm-hmm. I thank you for that for each of you. I want to close with one final question. When you think about the next year, what is one thing that needs to happen for this moment to lead to real, meaningful progress in people's everyday life?
That's a great question. I think two things that I'll highlight. One is, I think, fairly obvious. We need to have DTE and EES Coke be held accountable, meaning follow through on the judgment that the court entered in this case, pay their penalty, put in their $20 million for community projects, and upgrade their facility with the better pollution control technology. I think that's at a bare minimum. And like Rhonda mentioned earlier, we need the state of Michigan, I think, to take a look at itself and figure out how did we miss this, and then why didn't we come in and support this case once the Department of Justice, Sierra Club, and River Rouge joined in. It's very common, I would say, like most cases where you have sort of a pro-environment state regulatory agency in place, where there is a major sort of lawsuit against a alleged violator in that state, like we had here, the state joins that case and participates in it and supports, in this case, the EPA in bringing that case. And in this case, also Sierra Club residents in the city of River Rouge. State of Michigan did not join this case. And to date, they really haven't taken any meaningful action to address what's going on at the coke oven battery. And I think that raises questions just about what is the air quality division at the state of Michigan, that the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy doing? What's our Attorney General doing? Like, why isn't this case catching their attention? Because you can't always, they're supposed to be the primary enforcers for these kinds of facilities. And if we didn't have, really invested people at the EPA and Department of Justice and lawyers and the folks at Sierra Club, like this case wouldn't have happened, and that's a real shame.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Rhonda.
Well, I think that Nick answered it well. I cannot understand the failure of the state, and so to come in and assist us to recognize what's going on here. That is an absolute failure. So what's happening with Eagle? Who's running that place? And then I think it also speaks to the governor. Do she know what's going on out here? Do she represent all of the people? I don't know. It's not looking like that way. Are we, the people, so insignificant that we're just simply off the charts? We're not noticed. And so to me, that is one of the major principles of environmental justice, that the people speak for themselves and that they're heard. Okay. And there's two studies. There's a number of studies, but one is race and waste. You can take a look at that. We have a professor at U of M that contributed to that study. And it's not just waste that they're looking at pollution. There's another study that looks at the proximity of toxic sites like EES Coke to schools. Okay, so you have EES Coke, a new state, a new international bridge, the other international bridge, I-75, all of these polluting facilities impacting the daily lives of everyone, but in particular the children. What's going on?
Definitely. Thank you both so much. Before we get to reader questions, or listener questions, is there anything else that either of you would like to add?
Let's get to it.
Okay. All right. We have a question from Candy and Gotti. So are they still making Coke here? Where is that Coke going to? Ford Motor no longer makes their own steel up the River Rouge in Dearborn, if I understand correctly. Thank you.
Yeah, so they are still making Coke at the battery. And for those of you that maybe don't know, Coke is essentially coal that's burned and distilled into sort of like a fine powder called coke. And then that coke is used essentially as a fuel in steel making. And so generally, EES Coke and DTA are sending the coke that's produced on Zug Island to steel mills across the country. So some of that, I think, in the past has gone to the Dearborn facility that's run by Cleveland Cliffs, although they've idled a lot of their steelmaking operations lately. So I would imagine not there. But it goes to steel mills generally across the country. Is sort of generally where it's gone.
Great. Next question. What should folks garner from this judgment in respects to the EPA finally taking action?
I don't know. I would say that they finally took some action.
Well, and I think why they finally took some action, this is just my opinion, but like Rhonda mentioned, you've had local residents, Sierra Club members in this community being very vocal and very organized around air quality for a long, long time, like decades. And I think, oftentimes that work can be sort of very tedious and it can be hard to see the progress you're making. But I think this is what that progress looks like. I don't think EPA is paying attention to this facility if they aren't hearing from residents, if they don't know, like, oh, air pollution in Southwest Detroit and River Rouge is a big concern from the people that live there. I think essentially all of that work captured the hearts and minds of the people that work at EPA, and they were the ones that essentially started this case. And so I think it's just a testament to all of the advocacy residents have been doing there for decades.
And next question, can DTE seek a rate increase to cover the cost of the penalty?
We don't think they can, but they can try all sorts of things. We'll have to wait and see. In general, like this coke battery is not associated with DTE's sort of utility functions. Like, it doesn't have anything to do with distributing gas or electricity to residents, to households. And so since it's essentially kind of like a really lucrative and high stakes side hustle, more or less, for DTE. Like, it's just sort of this side thing that they run to make, I guess, a little extra money. I don't know why they do it. You'd have to ask them. But so I don't think they can go and seek a rate increase from ratepayers to cover sort of the costs from breaking the law in terms of their side hustle, essentially.
Mhm.
Right. And I think it also will address, hopefully, the number of deaths, that happen, in addition to if there's a rate increase. We have to also look at health and continue to look at the health impacts of what's going on. And there is a cost to that. And it's something that we don't take a look at. We'll look at DTE will tell you, well, if we put this device on, that's going to increase the cost. It's going to be millions and millions of dollars to put this piece of equipment on. Nobody is talking about the cost of the lives that are happening, and let's look at that cost.
Absolutely. Yeah. What do we got next? Is there an upcoming event to talk with residents to explain the details of the judgment?
There is, yeah. So there's going to be a community event hosted by the Sierra Club on Saturday, April 11th at 3 o'clock, 3 to 4:30 at River Rouge High School. And so Miss Anderson will be there. I'll be there. Some of the other attorneys that worked on the case will be there just to kind of go over what happened in the case, what's coming next, and how to get involved, those kinds of things.
Great, thank you. How can people get involved and partner with the community, as mentioned by Ms. Anderson?
Okay, well, you can start out by coming to this meeting in April. That'd be a great way to actually meet one-on-one with the attorneys, with staff from the Sierra Club, and no telling who's going to show up, So that would, to me, would be one excellent way. I would also suggest that that one, people can read about some of the things that are happening in regards to the environment. Like I said, we're talking about environmental justice issues, right? Why did environmental justice come about?
Mm-hmm.
It's been in discussion for some decades now, but there was definitely a reason to start organizing and talking about the environmental justice movement. That movement is not stagnant. It's happening right now all over the country. And there's a number of organizations that would love for people to become involved with them and to get the word out about how environment is having an impact on residents. And then you also have the major issue of climate change. We got to know what's going on with climate change. We also need to know about there could be a discussion about the Black community, at all of the communities, but definitely Black community, and the issue of energy. What is it? Is it something that we think about every day, or just something that we think about every now and then? But I think that as we progress, the issue of energy is going to be primary. Who has energy? Who can get it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for listening, and please follow our ongoing coverage. So today's conversation makes one thing clear. This ruling is not an endpoint, it's a starting point. For testing whether enforcement can match ambition, whether industry can operate differently, and whether communities that have carried this burden for generations will finally see tangible improvements in their health and their quality of life. The path forward will depend on what happens next, on oversight, follow through, and on whether the voices of impacted residents remain at the center of the conversation. I want to thank our speakers, Leonard and Rhonda Anderson, for sharing their expertise, their time, and their experiences with us today. And thank you for everyone who joined. We'll continue.
Thank you, Planet Detroit.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll continue to follow this story closely, and take care and have a great afternoon.
Okay.
Bye, everybody.